Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest in today's show is Preston Dennett. He's a field investigator for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of several books and more than 100 articles on UFOs and the paranormal. The book he authored that I'll be yakking with him about today is UFOs Over New York, a true history of extraterrestrial encounters in the Empire State. Preston Dennett, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
The first sighting of a UFO in New York State was over 150 years ago. Could you tell me something about that sighting? Where in New York was it seen? Who saw it? And what did the people who saw it say it looked like?
New York has quite a history, and the early sightings weren't really interpreted as extraterrestrial because that just wasn't in the public consciousness at that time. So they often just referred to them as astronomical events of some kind. I think the earliest one I found that was really convincing was around 1833, quite some time ago. And this occurred on November 13, when an object described as large, square, and luminous was seen hovering over the Niagara Falls area for actually more than an hour. And this was quite widely viewed by about 1,000 people, both on the American side and the Canadian side, though no explanation was really offered. There's not a whole lot of details on this particular sighting, but there was another one equally impressive, I think, on April 12th, 1879. And I like this case because the observer was actually a professional astronomer. His name was Harry Harrison, and he observed this glowing circular-shaped object hovering over New York Harbor. And what was really puzzling about this was this object was remaining in place for a very long time. Of course, the Earth rotates, so all the stars were moving, but this object wasn't. So it clearly wasn't any sort of astronomical body. Of course, the next day it was gone, and he reported this sighting to the Naval Observatory in Washington, but received no response. And he contacted the New York Tribune and Scientific American, who did publish his account. And what's also interesting is there was another astronomer, Spencer J. DeVoe, who also observed this object, described it as, quote, wonderfully brilliant. So yeah, some very, very early sighting in New York, which is really amazing because, I've looked into a number of other states and their history does not go as far back as New York.
There were sightings of flying saucers in downtown New York City, on Broadway, and at the mother of all skyscrapers, the iconic Empire State Building. Could you describe the specifics of those sightings?
The Empire State Building comes up in a number of cases. One gentleman who was actually on the Empire State Building when he saw objects and was able to photograph them. So very interesting. It's hard to recall the specific case because there's honestly so many of them. There's one case that comes to mind, which I think is really interesting. I like this one because it was investigated by James McDonald, who was really one of the first scientists to take this phenomena seriously. And he called this the perfect case. This one occurred on June 23rd, 1955. And what's great about this case is it has multiple witnesses, both on the air and on the ground, and radar confirmation. One of the witnesses was a pilot, or co-pilot rather, of a Mohawk DC-3 Airlines, cruising at about 3,000 feet above Utica, and he saw this object about 500 feet above his plane. And it was just moments later that two other airlines in this area also observed this object, and air traffic controllers at Albany Airport were monitoring these radio transmissions and also saw the UFO. And radar operators in Boston actually tracked this. So this was a very well verified case, absolutely unexplained. It did make it to the Condon Committee, which was studying UFOs for the Air Force, and they were not able to explain it either. And James McDonald called this, quote, a most intriguing report that must certainly be classed as an unknown pending further study, which it certainly deserved. And he called it the perfect case. I mean, there are a lot of cases of these objects hovering right over the urban centers. What's interesting about these New York cases is often UFOs are really evasive, but in these cases, it seems like they really want to be observed.
Beloved musician, singer, and songwriter Jimi Hendrix, considered by many to be the greatest rock guitarist of all time, claimed to have been saved by aliens in upstate New York. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, certainly. I love this case, which actually comes from Brian McKnight, who was part of Jimi Hendrix's musical group. And they were driving in upstate New York through a snowstorm and got stranded in a snowdrift. So this was quite a dangerous situation for them. Jimi Hendrix, by the way, does have a history of UFO sightings, which he has talked about. He never talked about this particular incident publicly, but Brian McKnight was there. The other band members were in the van, but they were asleep. So it was just Jimi Hendrix and Brian McKnight. When they're in the van, stranded, getting colder and colder, and this object lands in front of them on the road. It was a very large, bright object, size of a small house, maybe, large room, very brightly lit, and we're looking at it, staring at it in amazement. I mean, it's obviously unexplained. There's no possible chance of misperception when something is this close. As they watch, an opening appears, and out comes this very tall, glowing figure, and it approaches their car and actually goes around it. And they were shocked to see that this figure was actually melting the snow all around their vehicle. They took it as, very much intentional and sort of a rescue in a sense. After a few moments, this thing left. Brian McKnight had the sense that Jimmy was communicating telepathically with this being and asked about it. And Jimmy just kind of smiled and said, "No, we won't talk about this. This is our special secret. Don't tell anyone." So he took this basically to his grave. And only years later, Brian McKnight went public with this. But I think it's a great case because, again, Jimmy has talked about earlier sightings throughout his life. And I think he was probably a full-blown contactee. It's a really interesting case. And I love it because a lot of cases of musicians who have seen UFOs, such as John Lennon, is a good example. Also another New York case. The Jimi Hendrix case is really interesting to me.
Absolutely fascinated with it. In addition to Jimi Hendrix, other celebrities have said they had UFO encounters. You just mentioned another one. Could you tell me who some of those celebrities are and the UFO encounters they experienced?
Yeah, it's actually quite surprising how many New York celebrities there are who have seen UFOs. Of course, Muhammad Ali, who said he was jogging through Central Park early in the morning and he saw UFOs several times and became very vocal about it. I mean, he went on Johnny Carson and talked about it, but a lot of New York celebrities. In 1953, Mel Torme, very well-known singer, said he stepped out of the courtyard of his downtown Manhattan apartment and with his little dog Spooky and saw this red light darting around. As they watched it, it was clearly unexplained. As Mel says, it moved horizontal faster than my eyes could follow it before stopping dead in its path. Then it did lazy loops, almost like a figure eight. It made more circles, and then noiselessly, it went zap again to another part of the sky. So this was about 5,000 feet up. And when something is silent, when it's darting around, stopping on a dime, turning at right angles, I mean, this is clearly not a balloon, plane, helicopter. It's a great sighting. And with a witness like Mel Torme, I mean, why would he lie about it? He's putting his reputation on the line talking about this. That I think is really interesting. Probably the most famous celebrity sighting is, of course, John Lennon's sighting, which occurred in 1974 when he was in his apartment in Manhattan Island again with his girlfriend May Pang. And they both saw this typical flying saucer floating not far away at about eye level to them. They called the police. The police said that they had received a flood of calls about this same object. So it's not just him, him and her seeing this. A lot of people saw this. It's a really interesting and classic sighting. Of course, Jimi Hendrix, punk rocker Helen Wheels, and her brother, who, by the way, is Peter Robbins, pretty well-known UFO researcher. A little bit of coincidence and synchronicity there. So yeah, some very interesting celebrity sightings in New York for sure.
Sightings of UFOs have been reported by people flying on regular commercial airlines. Are there similarities in those sightings or do they differ?
They're pretty much the same. What I like about the sightings from airliners is we're dealing with pilots. Pilots are professionals. They're trained observers. They are people who are very familiar with aircraft and should be able to, identify any type of aircraft in the sky. I think that adds an extra level of credibility to the pilot sightings. There was a very interesting sighting called the Ryan Neff sighting. This was a great case because this involved an object that was, they contacted the local Air Force when they saw this thing, and the Air Force actually asked them to follow this object. Mind you, this is a commercial airliner filled with passengers. So they followed this object for many miles, and it's a very well verified case. It came very close to their plane at one point. Finally, after following this for quite some time, they realized they were getting far, far off course and decided that they had better turn around. But it's a very, very famous sighting. I think very well known in the UFO community. This occurred on April 8, 1956. Yeah, it was a brilliant white object. In fact, when they first saw it, it was in front of their plane heading towards them, and they were afraid they would actually collide right with it. This was confirmed by Griffiths Air Force Base, and they sent out 2 jet fighters. It wasn't only the pilots who saw this. Stewardess Phyllis Reynolds, she also saw it. And it's amazing that this case, because the Air Force, as I said, actually ordered the pilots to follow this. So this is a civilian aircraft which came under military control. It's unheard of. This was a very controversial case, but was well verified. Major Donald Kehoe, who was really a strong proponent of UFOs at that time, really tried to investigate this case and says the Air Force absolutely stonewalled him from step one. And he had a really difficult time. And he says they outright lied to him. And another really interesting tidbit about this case is Donald Menzel, a professional astronomer and UFO debunker, said that this object was actually Venus, which is laughable because these pilots said, no, it came very close to their aircraft. We nearly collided with it. Could not have been Venus. They know what Venus looks like. A ridiculous debunking explanation because they actually had to make an emergency turn. And this object followed them, zoomed by them at about 1,000 miles per hour, they estimate. It's a great case.
Oneida Lake is the largest lake entirely within New York State. UFO activity has been reported in the area, as well as the appearance of circles. In fact, geologists intrigued by those crop circles visited the area and investigated them. What were their findings?
The crop circles are very interesting, largely limited to England, people thought. That turned out not to be true. There are many cases of crop circles all over the world. And of course, some did appear in New York State. One famous one occurred in the town of Columbia, and this was in July of 1993. It was a 25-foot wide crop circle. It appeared in the oat field of a lady by the name of Helen Hick, and it caused quite a stir because there had been a sighting of a round cylindrical object just a few days earlier, and it was 2 days after the sighting that this crop circle was discovered, and 20-acre oat field, and observers came. There was a lot of people. This caused quite a bit of press attention, and according to one witness, the oats were flattened very close to the ground, and there was no apparent intertwining or braiding effect in any of. There were 4 circles in all, so one was about 88 feet across, one was 45 feet across, and the smallest was 25 feet. Researchers of crop circles had learned how to tell whether these were fake or not because they were exposed to heat, the legitimate ones. And Dr. Levengood, who was a very well-known, probably the most prominent crop circle researcher, determined that these were in fact genuine crop circles because the nodes were actually split, and it appeared that they had been exposed to some sort of perhaps microwave like radiation. But yeah, it appears to be a genuine crop circle. The researchers who looked into it are absolutely convinced it was genuine. But yeah, there's been a number of them in New York. There was another one in 1994 in a cornfield, 19-foot crop circle. This was along the north shore of Oneida Lake. Again, the same thing. They believed that this had to be artificially made. They don't think this was caused by perhaps whirlwinds or tornadoes, which really aren't common in New York anyway. So hard to say for sure. Yeah, the crop circle phenomena is quite bizarre, and it is absolutely worldwide, and cases have happened in New York.
New York has experienced numerous blackouts over the years, many spread throughout the Northeast to the rest of the U.S., and even into Canada. During these massive power failures, strange objects appeared in the skies. There are those who claim UFOs caused those blackouts. What was the reasoning?
The most famous in history, really in the world, was the Great New York Blackout. My father was actually there. This occurred on November 9, 1965, and was up to that time the largest blackout in United States history, affecting more than 5 million homes, 80,000 square miles, some 36 million people, really about 1/5 of the nation's population. The official explanation was a quote, a faulty relay at the Sir Adam Beck power plant in Clay, New York. But that is not what most researchers who have looked into this think, because immediately, actually in the days before this huge blackout, there was quite a bit of UFO activity. And on that night, hundreds of people reported UFOs all across the state and in neighboring states for that matter. There was a very famous sighting by a pilot, Robert C. Walsh, who was flying about 1,500 feet above Syracuse when the blackout actually struck. And he observed what he called a ball of fiery light 50 feet in diameter. And there were other pilots, a pilot by the name of Weldon Ross and his student, James Brooking, were flying over the airport, and they described a glowing ball-shaped body traveling over the power line. So these are just a few of the witnesses. There are literally hundreds. There's a sexton at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, William Stilwell, who had a telescope, and he actually observed these objects through his telescope. He did take photographs. There were a number of photographs taken, one which did appear, and I believe it was Time magazine. But according to Stilwell, he saw some of these objects hanging in the sky for over a period of hours. And some of the witnesses described not just, glowing globes of light, but actual, classic flying saucer. I mean, the number of witnesses is far too many for this to be debunked or explained away. It's just an amazing, amazing case. I mean, it made it to the congressional investigations on UFOs. Following this, there was a congressional study of UFOs. According to some rumors, this caused a lot of concern at high levels within the military, who believed that the UFOs had in fact caused this power outage. And I think there's some reason to think that, because there's a report coming from an actor by the name of Stuart Whitman, fairly well known, starred in a number of movies. He was in his apartment in New York City when he was woken up by this sort of strange sound, heard his name being called, and looks out the window and sees these two objects. They started to speak to him telepathically. And I know how this might sound to a skeptic, but this is not uncommon in UFO contactee reports. And this voice basically told him that this was an intentional display, that they had the ability to shut off our power. They were very concerned about our use of nuclear weapons, and they wanted him to go public and let the people know, let the world know that ETs are watching over them, and that we need to stop messing around with nuclear power. We need to racial prejudice, hatred, bigotry, and our warlike ways. Credit to Stuart Whitman for going public with this. He absolutely insists this happened, said he'd swear on a Bible, said he was not frightened, but strangely elated, he says, I had no fear. I somehow knew they would do no harm, but I'll swear on a Bible that I saw them and that they talked to me. So yeah, this is a great case. The newspapers were receiving hundreds of calls. Something was clearly going on in this case.
Of the people who claim to have been abducted by alien beings, what percentage said they were experimented on? And if they were, what type of experiments were performed on them?
That's a difficult question to answer, because the word experiment is somewhat open to interpretation.
Agree.
And when someone is taken on board, I will say that the most common thing they experience, and this is certainly true with New York, is that they are physically examined and samples are taken, skin, blood, hair, genetic samples. And some people feel like this is an experimentation, where others are like, no, it was just a checkup. I wasn't frightened at all. Others were deeply traumatized. Some have amnesia following their encounter, missing time. Others who perhaps did not have a strong fear response don't. I will say, during the Hudson Valley UFO wave, 1982, thereabouts to 84, 85, was one of the most intense UFO waves in U.S. history, largely located in upstate New York and the Hudson Valley area, but really, parts of Connecticut and surrounding areas, very active. A lot of sightings. I mean, it was stopping cars over highways. Police stations were being flooded by hundreds of calls. It was a hugely intense wave, and it wasn't just sightings. There was a lot of people, we found out later, researchers did, who claimed to have been taken on board. So this was not only a huge spike in sighting, but a huge spike in reports of being taken on board. And you have a really wide variety of, descriptions of what happened to people, but they do follow pretty much a set pattern: being physically examined, perhaps being given messages of various kinds, often involving warnings of some kind, warnings against nuclear proliferation, environmental destruction, our warlike ways. They will ask people about, music and culture and things that we consider, well known, but them as perhaps unfamiliar with our society, are asking questions that we would think of as being bizarre. But yeah, the whole abduction movement really had a lot of its origin in New York, thanks to the work of Bud Hopkins, who popularized this subject with his book Missing Time. It was the first book about onboard experiences that did really well. He had a lot of New York cases. And of course, Whitley Strieber in his cabin in upstate New York, in Crawford, I believe it was, not far from Pine Bush, which is a super duper hot spot, which became very famous. I mean, if you wanted to see a UFO, you would go to Pine Bush. And people did. And it's still famous to this day. They hold annual UFO festivals in Pine Bush because people could go there and actually see UFOs. So the whole abduction movement had its origins largely. I mean, we owe New York quite a bit of credit to our understanding of the UFO phenomena, because its contributions to it are undeniable.
From your research of people who said they had visitations from extraterrestrials, did any of them say if the ETs communicated to them why they were chosen? Was it random, or was there a specific reason they were chosen?
There's not a whole lot of direct communication as to why, but I think as researchers, we did figure it out. And probably the main pattern, I looked into this because it's evenly divided between men and women. So I'm like, okay, that's not it. Could it possibly be anything to do with, religion or education or race or blood type? And there was really no strong pattern. There's some indication that people who have Rh negative blood type are more prone to having this experience. And that does seem to be true. However, there's people of all blood types who are having this. So it's not a hard and fast pattern. The strongest pattern for sure, and would account for at least 50% of people who are being taken on board, perhaps more. This phenomena, onboard experiences, does seem to be very prevalent along family lines. It tracks families, generationally speaking. So if someone is claiming to be taken on board, chances are very good their parents perhaps were, or grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, somewhere along the family line. And researchers have looked into this. Bud Hopkins was the first to really cement this, but this has been verified by pretty much all major researchers. And I will say that's true in my own file. This does track family, and we've got cases going back several generations. And some contactees have been told this flat out, that we are tracking your family line. One very famous contactee, Jim Spark, did ask about this, and they said, yes, we have tracked your family lines. And they showed him images of going all the way back to Victorian times, to Roman times, really all the way to prehistoric caveman time. And I know another lady I interviewed personally, she was told that they were tracking her family all the way back to biblical times. So this does seem to relate to one of their main agendas, which is the hybrid baby agenda, I guess would be the best way to put this. Many people who are taken on board, both men and women, are shown baby and told, this baby is yours. This has your genetic. And these children are not fully human. We have these, what we call the gray type ETs. Their description is very consistent. Large heads, bald, very large dark eyes, small facial features, nose and mouth, ears, very short, 3-4 feet, perhaps up to 5, very slender bodies, but essentially humanoid. Probably share the same genetics genetics as us because abductees have been told that. I mean, there is a case in New York. A lady had visitations by Greys and she screamed out, "Oh, you're so ugly." And they said, "Don't worry, or one day you could look just like us." And according to the story from many contactees, abductees, experiencers, call them what you will, the Greys have said as much, that we used to look like you, but we have suffered genetic damage due to, the story varies here somewhat, but it's essentially the same, due to wars, conflicts, genetic intervention, radiation damage from space travel, and that they have lost the ability to reproduce, have lost some of their abilities to feel emotions. And this is why they're hybridizing with us to sort of bring that back, to revitalize their genetic, reinvigorate their DNA, bring back their ability to reproduce. And I think this is very well verified because a lot of contactees are saying this. I've talked to them myself, and many of these contactees do not read UFO books. UFOs come on TV, they will turn it off. They're somewhat frightened, a lot of them, by this whole subject and have no exposure to it. So to hear these people who do not know each other, who have no exposure to the subject, saying the same story over and over again adds a level of corroboration and credibility to these accounts. So yeah, I think genetics is really one of the driving forces behind who's being contacted. But if I may, there is another pattern I did notice because I started looking at like people's profession because I kept hearing a lot of people who were human rights activists or social workers or environmentalists or doctors, musicians, people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity are often the ones who are being contacted. And I'll just give you one example. A gentleman I interviewed from New York was a nurse. And I'm like, oh, here's this pattern again. And he had lifelong experiences from a little boy. He remembered strange figures entering into his room at night. He has two older brothers. They weren't having experiences. He fits the pattern right down the line. He's had unexplained nosebleeds. As a young man, started having missing time, and it was really quite traumatic for him. This was not something he liked. Some people are okay with their experiences, others aren't, and he had a real hard time with it. He ended up seeking therapy, a therapist who finally told him, "You know what, I can't help you. You are going to have to seek out a UFO researcher because I am convinced that is your problem." He thought maybe, there was another explanation. Most of his experiences were shrouded in missing time until one day he's driving along a highway. This is in New York, and his cell phone rings, and he's looking at it, and it says no number, and it made a sound it couldn't even make, and it kept ringing. He kept hanging it up. Finally, he answers it, and a voice comes on with all these weird clickings and high pitches and buzz. It said, "We are coming. The time is near." That freaked him out. And I know how this must sound to people, but this is a thing. Bud Hopkins has cases where, his star client, Kathy Davis was the pseudonym. She's now gone public. Debbie Jordan Cobble had this same experience. Ray Fowler also reported this with Betty Andreas. And this was happening to Kenneth. He was receiving these weird phone calls. And this was one of them. And it freaked him out. And it was shortly after this, he was in his apartment in New York when he was visited by Greys. They appeared. Next thing he knows, he's pulled on board. And they said, "Have no fear. We are not here to harm you," which is really the most common thing the Greys or any ETs will tell a person. They said, "You need to know why we contact." And they showed him this small child, not a baby, maybe 3-4 years old. They said, "This is your child. Aren't you happy?" And he said, no. He was furious. And now he was angry because he was quite traumatized by these experiences. And he was also quite frightened, angry. Looking at this child, he was somewhat repulsed also. But at the same time, his paternal instincts kicked in big time. And he felt a lot of love for this child. So he's having all these mixed and conflicting emotions, which was very, very difficult for him. I mean, he was tearing up as he described this to me. They said, "This was why we contacted you." And he was puzzled by this because he says, "Honestly, my genetics are not great." He says, "I have high blood pressure. I've got Crohn's disease. I'm a heavy smoker. It seems quite puzzling to me that they would pick me." But another pattern that turns up again and again is that people who are being contacted are quite psychic. They have a wide variety of paranormal experiences, and this can come before the encounter or afterward. And in this gentleman's case, it came afterwards. He started having psychic visions. And in fact, they got so strong he couldn't ignore them. He would see people and be compelled to walk up to them and give them a psychic reading. In fact, he would hear the Greys telepathically talking to him, telling him, "You have a job to do. Go talk to these people." So this again speaks towards why people are being contacted. They are psychically waking people up. They're trying to wake up all of humanity. And I asked him, "Do you can you provide specific examples? And he happily did. He said, members walking up to one person and telling them that their wheel was about to fall off, the lug nuts were loose, or the brakes. And one time he saw this lady on the street. These voices came on, talk to her. You need to talk to her. He's like, what am I going to say? But these images would come to his mind. And he walked up to this woman. He doesn't know her from anyone, says, you need to go home. You need to go home right now and talk to your husband. And she looked at him like he was nuts. And he walked away. And of course, he normally does not get any confirmation of this. But in this case, he did, because it was about a year later, real quick here, he was in line at the grocery store. And there was this lady. And she saw him and recognized him and left her line and went to his line and said, you're that man. You're that man who spoke to me last year, aren't you? And he's embarrassed and somewhat, he's a shy guy. He says, yeah, that was me. She says, I just have to thank you. You have no idea. When I went home, I listened to you. You seemed so sincere. I went home that night, had a wonderful dinner with my husband, and we talked deep into the night, went to bed. And that night, her husband died in his sleep, peacefully passed away. And she said, I have to thank you. I was able to have this wonderful last evening with my husband, which I would not have had if not for you.
Of all the UFO sightings you've investigated, as well as the investigations of experiencers, people who were visited by and interacted with ETs in New York, did any of them stand out more than the others?
There was a sighting that I thought was really impressive because it was right over the United Nations building. There are actually a couple. I thought that was kind of interesting and perhaps symbolic or significant. But really one of my favorite was the Cherry Creek UFO landing in 1965. This is a great case because this was actually investigated by Project Blue Book, U.S. Air Force UFO study, which was somewhat, I'm not even sure how to put this, but it wasn't a legitimate study. J. Allen Hynek, who was the astronomical consultant, actually defected from Project Blue Book because he said they would pay very close attention to cases that had obvious prosaic explanations, such as Venus or a balloon. Whenever they had a case that was clearly unexplained, they would not investigate it, would instead attack the witness and look for psychological problems and this sort of thing. So Project Blue Book was very controversial, somewhat probably more of a public relations exercise. However, in 1965 in Cherry Creek, New York, this family, the Butcher family, had an incredible encounter. Their son was outside in the barn and heard this strange noise, this kind of whistling, whooshing noise, and saw this object. And it actually came in for a landing. And he ran into the house and the whole family came out. Most of them saw it. This thing took off quite quickly. It had left an area of crushed grass and actually left some sort of residue. Their animals were freaking out. In fact, they had a bull who was chained up, and the bull was acting up so severely he bent the metal bar that he was tied up to. And this case attracted quite a bit of attention because numerous residents of Cherry Creek also observed this object as it was darting around, not only on that day, but prior to it and in the days afterward. So this was apparently not an isolated sighting, but this object came in for a landing and it attracted the attention of Project Blue Book officers who showed up just a few days afterwards to investigate it and were very impressed. The whole family gave testimony. They found lots of other witnesses. Other researchers have since looked into this case and found more witnesses. And Project Blue Book was unable to explain this case and actually labeled it unidentified, which is, I think, one of about 17 cases in New York City, or New York State rather, which are unidentified. It's a great case. I think probably one of my favorites. This was August 19th, 1965.
Thank you for sharing that. Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy UFOs Over New York or learn of the many other books you've written on UFOs, ghosts, and varied other paranormal topics, how did they do that?
I do have a website. If you punch my name into the internet, it should take you there. The actual address is prestondennett.weebly.com. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel. My books are on Amazon and other online retailers or bookstores. I really appreciate you having me on this show, Stan. I think this is a hugely important subject. I know there are people out there who are still skeptical, but I'm telling you, you haven't done your homework if you're skeptical of this, because the evidence is pretty much conclusive at this point.
Your writing proves that. I'm fascinated with that. And with all these other books you've written, I definitely look forward to yakking with you in the future about your other books, because you're in every aspect of the paranormal as I am. So I love it. Preston Dennett, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. I wish you continued success with all your writing pursuits. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you don't miss any interviews on my free YouTube channel, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.